Today's topic is fertilization. Before we go into see fertilization, let us learn about the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination, cross-pollination and significance of pollination. Next, we are going to learn about advantages of self-pollination. Self-pollination is almost certain in bisexual flower. What is meant by bisexual flower? The flower possesses both the sex organ. The flower possesses both the essential organs are called as a bisexual flower. So in bisexual flower, the self-pollination occurs. When the members of the species are uncommon and are separated by large distance, the plant has to depend on self-pollination. So the same member is present on distance. In this flowers, the self-pollination is occur. If all the chance of cross-pollination falls, only self-pollination will take place and prevent the extinction of the species. If there is chance of cross-pollination is less in these plants, the self-pollination is occur and prevent the extinction of the species. That is the extinction. The flowers which are going to dangerous position can be protected by the self-pollination. The next disadvantages of self-pollination. The continuous self-pollination causes the weaker progenies. So continuous self-pollination, generation after generation, result in the weaker progenies. The progenies means the young ones which are formed by means of repeated self-pollinations are very weak and they can be possess only less amount of endosperm. They are very weak. They does not show any new characters. The chance of producing new species and varieties are very less in number, very smaller in number. So the disadvantages of self-pollinations are the repeated self-pollination causes weaker progenies, that is weaker animals. The chance of producing new characters or the new species and varieties are very small in nature. The next advantages of cross-pollination. It results to bring out the much healthier offsprings. By means of cross-pollination, the plants which are produced are healthier in nature. It shows many superior characters than their parent because the combination of two causes new character, and also the plant which are produced by cross-pollinations are very healthier in nature. Germination capacity is much better compared to the cross-pollination seeds. The germination of the advantages of cross-pollination. Cross-pollinations result in the formation of new species which are more healthier than the existing one. It shows some useful characters compared to their parent. The germination capacity of the cross-pollinated seeds are much better than the self-pollinated plant because the endosperm of the cross-pollinated flowers are larger and they show vigorous growth compared to the self-pollinated plants. The new varieties may produce due to cross-pollination. The adaptability of the plant to their environment is better compared to their own parent. The next disadvantages of cross-pollination. Depend on external agencies for the pollination and the process is uncertain. So cross-pollination need any agents, either a biotic agent or abiotic agent. Sometimes it may not take place when the pollinator is absent. So it is a chance event compared to the self-pollination. The cross-pollination is a chance event. Various devices have to be adapted to attract the pollinating agents. So if suppose insect pollinated plant or it shows an attractive colors and scent or it produces smells. So it needs various devices to attract the pollinators. The next significance of pollination. The pollination is a prerequisite for the process of fertilization. So the fertilization means the fusion of male and the female gamete. The fusion of male and the female gamete takes place only after pollination. Pollination means the transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma. When the pollen grains reaches to the appropriate stigma, the pollen tube germinate and it approach into the ovule and causes the fertilization. So it is a pre-stage for the formation of a fertilization. The pollination is a very important event for fertilization. The fertilization helps in the formation of fruits and seed. The next, it brings the male and the female gametes closer to the process of fertilization. The pollination brings the male part, a male gamete pollen grains to the female gamete ovule closer for the process of fertilization. So the fertilization helps in the formation of fruit and seed. The last one, cross pollination introduce variation. Variation means the new characters which are arises in the plants due to cross pollination. In plants due to the mixing up of different genes. This variation helps the plants to adapt to the environment and resulting in speciation. Speciation means the formation of new species by means of cross pollination. So new useful variations are occurred due to variation. This leads to the evolution. The next topic, fertilization. Fertilization means the fusion of male and the female gamete is called as fertilization. The fusion product of male and the female gamete is called as a zygote. The fertilization is a very important event occurs in our angiosperm. The type of fertilization occurs in the angiosperm is called as double fertilization. The type of fertilization occurs in angiosperm is called as a double fertilization. The fertilization is a very important event occurs in the angiosperm to produce fruits and seeds. Next, events of fertilization. The events of fertilization involves several stages such as the germination of pollen to form pollen tube. The germination of pollen to form pollen tube when the pollen reaches to the stigma. When the pollen reaches to the proper stigma, the germination of pollen tube takes place. The pollen tube arises through the style and reach to the micropyle to reach ovule. The next stage is the growth of pollen tube in the style and direction of pollen tube towards the micropyle to the ovules. When the pollen tube reaches to the ovules, the entry of the pollen tube into one of the synergy to reach the embryo sac for the fusion. When it reaches the embryo sac, the fusion of male and the female gamete takes place is called as syngamy to produce zygote. The pollen tube carries two male gametes. One of the male gametes fuses with the egg to form zygote. The another male gamete fuses with the central nucleus or polar nucleus to form endosperm. The endosperm is used as a nutritive tissue for the developing embryo. The event of the pollen deposition on the stigma to the entry of the pollen tube into the ovule is called as the pollen pistil interaction. What does mean pollen pistil interaction? The event from the pollen tube deposit on the stigma to form the entry of the pollen tube into the ovule is called as pollen pistil interaction. It is a dynamic process which involves the deionization of the pollen and to promote or inhibit its germination and growth, whether it is a compactable or incompactable. The next, pollen on the stigma. In nature, a variety of pollen falls onto the receptive part of the flower stigma. The variety of stamens fall onto the receptive part of the stigma, but all of them are not germinate and bring out the fertilization. The receptive surface of the stigma receives the pollen. The receptive surface of the stigma receives the pollen. If the pollen is compactable with the stigma, it germinates into the pollen tube. This is facilitated by the two types of stigma, whether it is a Wet stigma, it produces stigmatic fluid. If it is a dry stigma, it having a penicil, the penicil attaches the fallen pollen grain to fixes in it. So these two also decide either the wet stigma and also penicil or dry stigma is involved in the decide the compatibility or incompatibility of the pollen through recognition rejection protein reaction. The recognition rejection protein is present in the stigmatic part, which only decide either it is a compatible or incompatible pollen to germinate the pollen tube. So sexual incompatibility may exist between the different species or called as a interspecific. If it is exist between the same species is called as the intraspecific. Sometimes the pollen of the same species, if it is fall on to the stigma of the same flower, it may unable to germinate the pollen tube. Such a type of sexual incompatibility is called as intraspecific. The intraspecific is also called as self-incompatibility. The same pollen, when it falls onto the stigma of the same flower, it is unable to germinate. It is called as a self-incompatibility. The first visible change in the pollen when it lands onto the stigma of the flower is through hydration. The pollen wall protein are released from the surface of the pollen. The pollen wall proteins are released from the surface of the pollen. During the germination of the pollen, the entire content of the pollen is moved to the tip region of the pollen tube. The entire content of the pollen is moved to the tip region of the pollen tube. The growth is restricted at the tip of the pollen tube, and all the cytoplasmic contents are moved to the tip of the remaining part of the pollen tube is occupied by a vacuole which is cut off from the tip by means of a callus plug. The extreme tip of the pollen tube appears hemispherical and transparent. It is called as cap plug. The extreme tip of the pollen tube is hemispherical and transparent. It is called as a cap block. As soon as the cap block disappears, the growth of the pollen tube is stopped. The next topic is pollen tube in the style. When the pollen grains start germinating the pollen tube enters into the style through the stigma. The pollen tube enters into the style through the stigmatic region to reach the embryo sac. The growth of the pollen tube in the style depends upon the type of a style. The type of style, there are three types of styles are there. One is a hollow style or open style, solid style or closed style, and a semi-solid style, that is half closed style. Hollow style. The hollow style is commonly present in monocots. It's running from the stigma at the base of the style. In this style region, a canal is lined by a single layer of glandular canal cells, that is transmitting cells. They secrete a mucilaginous substance. This mucilaginous substance attracts the pollen tube towards the style. The pollen tube grows on the surface of the cell lining the stylar canal. The canal is filled with the secretion which serves as a nutrition for growing pollen tube. The canal is filled with the secretion which is used as a food for the developing pollen tube and also controls incompatibility reaction between the style and the pollen tube. The secretion contains lipid, carbohydrates, enzymes like esters, acid phosphatase, and also it contains the protein, the controlling sexual incompatibility.